Two federal judges have ruled the government must continue to fund SNAP. The federal food assistance program was set to be frozen tomorrow as the government shutdown stretches into November. But more than 24 Democratic-led states sued the Trump administration over suspending the benefits. CBS News legal contributor Jessica Levinson joins us now to discuss. So, Jessica, these judges say the federal government needs to use contingency funds to keep SNAP up and running. Can you break that down for us?
Absolutely. There was a question as to whether or not the federal government was mandated based on the terms of the statute to continue to provide these SNAP benefits, even though we are in a government shutdown and no new budget has been passed. We now have two different district court judges looking at the statutes and saying that they believe the fact that there are contingency funds there and looking at, again, the language of the statute indicates that the federal government must provide.
Okay, this is absolutely wild. The Supreme Court just ignited fresh chaos that's rocking the Trump administration on two massive fronts at the exact same time. We're talking about food aid for millions of Americans and Trump's signature America First tariffs, both under assault at the highest court in the land, both creating panic in the West Wing, and both exposing just how fragile Trump's legal position really is on the issues he cares most about. On the SNAP front, the court first let Trump withhold full November food stamp payments from families who desperately needed them. Then they forced his lawyers into a last-minute scramble when a congressional funding deal made their emergency request completely moot. The whole thing exposed the administration's chaotic whiplash orders to states, telling them one thing, then another, then threatening sanctions if they didn't comply with constantly changing demands. And on tariffs, bruising oral argument signaled that a majority of justices, including conservatives Trump himself appointed, may be ready to gut his gold-alone trade powers entirely. The White House is now drafting fallback plans and warning Republicans to brace for economic and political turbulence that could reshape the 2026 landscape. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
At least partial funding for these programs. We should remind everybody that these are temporary restraining orders, meaning this is not a final ruling on the merit. Both judges are looking at who's likely to succeed, where there will be an irreparable risk of harm if you do or don't grant this emergency relief. And what we're seeing is, in one case, the judge is saying, federal government, I think you need to pay, let me know by Monday. In another case, a judge is saying something very similar, which is you need to pay, essentially tell me by Monday that you did, but both of them globally reaching the same conclusion.
And so what do we expect to happen in the next few days?
Appeals. And the question is whether or not these decisions will be put on pause while these cases are appealed. Obviously, we're talking about a situation where people may not be able to access these benefits. So when you're thinking about why do you typically grant emergency relief?
Let me break down what's happening with SNAP, because this is affecting real families trying to put food on the table right now. In early November, the Supreme Court, through Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, twice extended an emergency order that paused the district judge's ruling, requiring the government to fully fund roughly $4 billion in November SNAP benefits. That's $4 billion in food assistance that was supposed to go to low-income families, elderly Americans, disabled people, and others who depend on food stamps to survive. A lower court said Trump had to pay in full. The Supreme Court said, hold on, we're going to let Trump withhold those payments while the shutdown fight plays out. Millions of families who were counting on their full benefits suddenly didn't know if they have enough money to buy groceries. That's not an abstract policy debate. That's real hunger, real anxiety, real suffering inflicted on vulnerable people while courts and politicians figure out who has authority over what. But here's where the chaos really kicked in. During the window when the Supreme Court was letting Trump withhold full payments, the USDA sent states what's being described as a whiplash memo. The memo orders states not to issue full benefits and to immediately undo any steps taken to pay families in full. Think about what that means. States that had been trying to do the right thing, trying to get food assistance to families who needed it, were being told by the federal government to claw that money back. And the memo threatened sanctions for non-compliance, follow our constantly changing orders, or face penalties. States were caught in the middle, trying to figure out how to comply with federal demands while also not leaving families without food. It was administrative chaos with human consequences, bureaucratic whiplash that directly affected whether people could afford to eat. And then, after all of that, the administration withdrew its Supreme Court request after Congress passed a bill fully funding SNAP for the rest of the fiscal year. So the whole emergency fight at the Supreme Court, all the chaos and confusion and threats to states, all the anxiety for families wondering about their benefits, it became moot because Congress stepped in and solved the problem legislatively. The administration had been fighting tooth and nail at the Supreme Court to avoid paying full benefits, and then Congress made the whole fight irrelevant. That's not strategic brilliance. That's legal chaos that caused real harm to real people before circumstances changed and made the fight unnecessary. And it exposed how the administration operates, creating crises, fighting in court, issuing contradictory orders, and then having events overtake the whole mess. Now let's talk about tariffs, because this is where Trump's economic agenda faces an even bigger threat. On November 5th, the Supreme Court heard nearly 3 hours of arguments on Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs. This is Trump's signature economic policy, the tariffs he's used to reshape trade relationships with China, Europe, and other partners. He's claimed emergency powers to impose these tariffs unilaterally without going through Congress as part of his America First approach to trade. And multiple justices, including conservatives that Trump appointed, pressed the government hard on where the statute actually authorizes what Trump is doing. They asked pointed questions about whether declaring a trade emergency really gives the president unlimited power to tax imports. They questioned whether Congress ever intended the law to be used this way. Legal analysts who watched the arguments concluded that Trump's legal position is precarious and that the court is likely to strike down key parts of his tariff regime. The implications of losing on tariffs would be devastating for Trump's economic agenda and for his political brand. Policy and market commentators are warning that a defeat at the court will force Trump to either unwind large portions of his tariffs, giving up his biggest economic weapon, or push him into even more aggressive and legally dubious trade tactics that would add further chaos to global markets and American politics. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into exactly what happened with SNAP at the Supreme Court, why the tariff arguments went so badly for Trump, what fallback plans the administration is developing, and what all of this means for the kitchen table issues that affect every American family. Let's break it down. All right, so let's get into the specifics of what happened at the Supreme Court on SNAP benefits, because the sequence of events reveals just how chaotic and harmful the administration's approach has been. The fight started when Trump's administration decided during the government shutdown to only pay 65% of SNAP benefits instead of the full amount families were entitled to. Lower courts, multiple federal judges ruled this was illegal and ordered full payment using emergency and contingency funds that exist precisely for situations like shutdowns. The administration didn't want to comply. They wanted to use SNAP benefits as leverage in budget negotiations, holding food assistance hostage to get what they wanted on other issues. So they asked the Supreme Court to step in and pause the lower court orders while appeals proceeded. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson handles emergency matters for the circuit where these cases originated. She issued orders that effectively allowed the administration to withhold full payments while the legal fight continued. This wasn't a ruling on the merits. It wasn't a finding that Trump was right about the law. It was a procedural decision to maintain the status quo while courts figured out the substantive questions. But procedural decisions have real consequences. While the Supreme Court was deciding procedure, families were going without their full food benefits. Elderly people on fixed incomes were trying to figure out how to stretch 65% of their food money to cover 100% of their needs. Disabled Americans who depend on SNAP were facing real hunger because of legal maneuvering in Washington. The human cost of procedural delays is something courts sometimes forget, but families living with food insecurity never forget. The USDA memo ordering states to immediately undo any steps taken to pay families in full shows how aggressively the administration was trying to prevent people from getting their benefits. Some states, recognizing that the lower court rulings require full payment, had started processing full benefits for their residents. They were trying to follow the court orders and help families who needed assistance. The federal government responded by telling them to stop, not just to pause going forward, but to undo what they'd already done, claw back benefits that had already been issued, reverse payments that families were counting on. And if states didn't comply with these whiplash orders, they faced sanctions and financial penalties from the federal government. States were being punished for trying to feed hungry people, according to what courts had ordered. The threat of sanctions for non-compliance put state officials in an impossible position. They had court orders saying they had to pay full benefits. They had federal memos saying they'd be punished if they paid full benefits. They had families who needed food and didn't care about the legal technicalities. They just wanted to know if they could afford groceries this month. State administrators had to make real-time decisions about whether to follow court orders or federal directives, knowing that either choice could result in negative consequences. This is what happens when the federal government creates chaos deliberately. The chaos cascades down through state agencies and ultimately lands on the people who can least afford to deal with bureaucratic confusion. The withdrawal of the administration's Supreme Court request after Congress passed a SNAP funding bill is the final twist that shows how unnecessary all of this chaos was. Congress solved the problem by passing legislation that fully funded SNAP for the rest of the fiscal year. The shutdown ended. The funding questions became moot, and the administration quietly walked away from the Supreme Court fight they've been waging so aggressively. All the legal maneuvering, all the whiplash memos, all the threats to states, all the anxiety for families, it was rendered irrelevant by a legislative solution that could have happened sooner if the administration had been more interested in governing than in creating leverage through crisis. The Supreme Court never had to rule on the merits because circumstances changed, but the harm that was inflicted while the fight played out was real and can't be undone. Now let's turn to the tariff situation, because this is where Trump faces potentially permanent damage to his economic agenda. The Supreme Court heard arguments on November 5th about whether Trump has the legal authority to impose tariffs using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This law was originally designed to let presidents respond to genuine national emergencies by controlling economic transactions, freezing assets of terrorists, sanctioning hostile governments, blocking financial flows that threaten national security. Trump has stretched this law to cover routine trade disputes, claiming that trade imbalances constitute emergencies that justify imposing tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of imports from countries around the world. It's the legal foundation for his entire trade policy. The oral arguments went badly for the administration, really badly. Nearly 3 hours of questioning revealed deep skepticism from justices across the ideological spectrum. They pressed government lawyers on where exactly the statute authorizes tariffs. They questioned whether Congress ever intended to give presidents this much unilateral power over trade and taxation. They pointed to constitutional provisions that give Congress, not the president, authority over commerce and duties. They asked why the president should be able to impose what amounts to taxes on American consumers without congressional approval. The questioning wasn't friendly exploration of the government's position. It was hostile interrogation that exposed weaknesses in arguments the administration apparently thought were stronger than they are. Legal analysts who watched the arguments concluded that Trump's position is precarious. Multiple assessments suggest the court is likely to strike down at least parts of his tariff regime. Some analysts think the court might gut his emergency tariff authority entirely, finding that the statute doesn't authorize what Trump has been doing. Others think the court might rule more narrowly, finding that specific tariffs went beyond what the law allows while leaving some presidential authority intact. But almost nobody who watched those arguments came away thinking Trump is going to win outright. The question is how badly he's going to lose, not whether he's going to lose. The fallback plans the administration is reportedly developing show they reached the same conclusion. According to policy and market commentators, the White House is already working on alternative approaches in case the Supreme Court rules against them. They're looking at narrower, country-specific duties that might survive legal challenge. They're exploring negotiated trade agreements that wouldn't rely on emergency powers. They're considering whether different legal authorities might support some version of their trade policies. This planning has leaked, which is itself significant. It shows the administration doesn't believe their own public confidence about winning at the Supreme Court. When you're drafting detailed fallback plans, you're preparing for defeat regardless of what you say publicly. The economic and political consequences of losing on tariffs will be enormous. Trump has made tariffs central to his economic nationalism brand. He's claimed credit for protecting American workers and bringing manufacturing back through tough trade policies. If the Supreme Court rules those tariffs were illegal all along, it's not just a legal defeat, it's a fundamental challenge to Trump's economic narrative. He'd have to either abandon the tariffs or find new legal justifications that might not exist. Companies that have been paying tariffs might be entitled to refunds, creating administrative chaos and budget implications. Markets would face uncertainty about what trade policy will look like going forward. And Trump's claim to be a strong executive who can act decisively on trade would be exposed as legally hollow. The warnings about further chaos if Trump loses are based on his pattern of responding to legal defeats by escalating rather than accepting limits. If the court strikes down his tariff authority, Trump might try to impose tariffs through different legal mechanisms that are equally questionable. He might pick fights with the court publicly, undermining respect for judicial authority. He might push for legislation, giving him the powers the court says he doesn't have, creating battles in Congress. The defeat wouldn't necessarily end the tariff wars. It might just shift them to new battlegrounds while creating additional uncertainty for businesses and consumers who need to plan around stable trade policies. The intersection of the SNAP chaos and the tariff uncertainty creates a picture of an administration that's constantly in conflict with legal constraints on its power. On food assistance, they fought to withhold benefits until Congress made the fight moot. On tariffs, they're facing a Supreme Court that seems ready to rule against them on their signature economic policy. Both situations involve the administration claiming broad executive authority to act without congressional approval, and both situations involve courts and Congress pushing back on those claims. The pattern suggests that Trump's governing style, which depends heavily on unilateral executive action, may be fundamentally incompatible with legal and constitutional limits that courts are increasingly willing to enforce. Okay, Let's break this down into clear points so you understand exactly what's happening and why it matters so much. Point number 1, the Supreme Court, through Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, twice extended emergency orders that allowed Trump to withhold full SNAP payments during the shutdown, effectively letting the administration deprive roughly $4 billion in food assistance from families while the legal fight played out. This wasn't a ruling that Trump was right. It was a procedural decision that had devastating real-world consequences. While courts debated procedure, families went hungry. The human cost of legal maneuvering is easy to forget in Washington, but people living with food insecurity felt it directly. Point number 2, during the window, when the Supreme Court allowed reduced payments, USDA sent states a whiplash memo ordering them not to issue full benefits and to immediately undo any steps taken to pay families in full, threatening sanctions for non-compliance. States were caught between court orders requiring full payment and federal directives threatening punishment for full payment. The chaos was deliberate. The administration wanted to use food assistance as leverage in budget negotiations and was willing to create administrative confusion and threaten states to maintain that leverage. Families who just wanted to know if they could afford groceries were collateral damage in a political fight. Point number 3, the administration withdrew its Supreme Court request after Congress passed a bill fully funding SNAP for the rest of the fiscal year, making the entire emergency fight moot and exposing how unnecessary the chaos had been. All the legal maneuvering, the whiplash orders to states, the anxiety for families rendered irrelevant by a legislative solution. The administration had been fighting aggressively to withhold food benefits, and then Congress stepped in and funded the program, ending the fight. The harm inflicted during the fight was real and cannot be undone, but the fight itself turned out to be pointless. Point number 4, on November 5th, the Supreme Court heard nearly 3 hours of arguments on Trump's tariff authority, with multiple justices, including conservatives, pressing the government on where the statute actually authorizes what Trump has been doing. Analysts conclude his legal position is precarious, and the court is likely to strike down key parts of his tariff regime. The questioning was hostile, the government's answers were unconvincing, and almost nobody who watched thinks Trump will win outright. The question is how badly he loses, not whether he loses. Point number 5, policy and market commentators warn that a tariff defeat will force Trump to either unwind large portions of his signature trade policy or pursue even more aggressive and legally dubious tactics, adding further chaos to markets and politics. The administration is already developing fallback plans, which shows they don't believe their own public confidence about winning. When you're drafting detailed alternatives in case you lose, you're preparing for defeat regardless of what you tell the press. The leaked planning undercuts every claim of confidence the administration makes about the tariff case. Now let's talk about what this means for American families and the broader economy, because these Supreme Court fights aren't abstract legal debates. They affect kitchen table issues that matter to everyone. The SNAP chaos directly impacted families' ability to buy food. When the administration withholds benefits, people go hungry. When they issue contradictory orders to states, families don't know what assistance they can count on. When they use food programs as political leverage, the people who depend on those programs become pawns in negotiations they have no control over. The Supreme Court's procedural decisions, letting Trump withhold benefits while appeals proceed, had real consequences for real people, even though the court never ruled on whether the administration was actually right. Process has a price, and vulnerable families paid it. The tariff uncertainty hits families through prices, jobs, and economic stability. Tariffs function as taxes on imported goods, and those costs get passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. When the Supreme Court suggests Trump's tariffs might be illegal, businesses don't know what to plan for. Should they continue paying tariffs that might get refunded? Should they make investment decisions based on trade policies that might be struck down? The uncertainty itself is harmful to the economy even before any ruling comes down. And if the court does strike down the tariffs, the transition period will create additional disruption as companies and markets adjust to a new reality. The political dynamics heading into 2026 are shaped by these Supreme Court fights in important ways. If Trump loses on tariffs, he loses one of his signature issues, the claim to be protecting American workers through tough trade policies. Democrats will argue that his tariffs were always illegal overreach that the courts properly rejected. Republicans will have to explain why they supported policies that the Supreme Court found unconstitutional. If the SNAP chaos becomes a campaign issue, Democrats can point to the administration's willingness to use food assistance as a political weapon and the harm that caused to vulnerable families. Republicans will try to spin it as a budget dispute that Congress resolved, but the images of families worrying about food during the holidays won't be easy to erase. The Supreme Court's role in all of this is complicated and worth examining carefully. On one hand, the court has sometimes expanded presidential power in ways that benefit Trump, limiting nationwide injunctions, expanding immunity for official acts. On the other hand, the The court appears ready to rein in presidential authority on tariffs by finding that the statute doesn't authorize what Trump has been doing. The court isn't uniformly pro-Trump or anti-Trump. It's applying legal analysis to specific questions, and sometimes that analysis favors Trump, while other times it constrains him. The tariff argument suggests that even conservative justices have limits on how far they'll stretch to accommodate presidential claims of authority when the legal basis is weak. For the administration, these Supreme Court challenges represent a fundamental test of their governing approach. Trump has relied heavily on executive action, using emergency declarations, executive orders, and unilateral decisions to advance his agenda without going through Congress. That approach works when courts defer to presidential claims of authority. It fails when courts examine those claims carefully and find they lack legal support. The snap fight showed the limits of using administrative discretion to withhold congressionally appropriated funds. The tariff case may show the limits of using emergency powers for routine trade policy. If the court rules against Trump on tariffs, it signals that executive unilateralism has constitutional boundaries the president can't simply ignore. The broader question these cases raise is whether the legal system can effectively constrain a president who governs through constant assertion of powers that may or may not actually exist. Trump's approach has been to claim authority broadly, act on those claims immediately, and dare courts to stop him. Sometimes courts don't stop him quickly enough, and the damage is done before any ruling arrives. Sometimes courts do stop him, but the administration finds other ways to pursue similar goals. Sometimes the situation changes, like Congress funding SNAP, before courts rule at all. The legal system has shown some capacity to push back on Trump's most aggressive claims, but it's also shown significant limitations in preventing harm while legal processes unfold. Here's the bottom line. The Supreme Court has ignited fresh chaos for the Trump administration on two fronts simultaneously: food assistance for millions of families and his signature tariff powers. The SNAP fight saw the court let Trump withhold benefits before congressional action made the fight moot, exposing chaotic whiplash orders that hurt vulnerable families. The tariff arguments revealed deep judicial skepticism that has the administration drafting fallback plans and warning of economic turbulence. These aren't abstract legal questions. They're about whether families can afford groceries and whether businesses can plan around stable trade policy. So stay tuned, because the Supreme Court's decisions on these matters will reshape the economic and political landscape heading into 2026. Will the court gut Trump's tariff authority or find some way to preserve it? Will the SNAP chaos become a campaign issue that hurts Republicans in competitive races? Will the administration's pattern of aggressive executive action and subsequent legal setbacks convince voters that Trump governs through chaos rather than competence? The justices are simultaneously deciding how much control the president has over people's groceries and over the global economy. The stakes couldn't be higher for kitchen table issues that affect every American family. The administration is scrambling, Congress is watching, markets are nervous, and voters are seeing a presidency whipsawing between short-term wins and looming defeats at the highest court in the land. This is what happens when governing style collides with legal reality: chaos, uncertainty, and real consequences for real people caught in the middle of fights they never asked for. Pay attention, because what the Supreme Court decides next will affect your grocery bills, your job security, and the kind of economy we all have to live in. The chaos isn't ending anytime soon.